The Mediterranean Sea does not keep time the way we do. It breathes with a slow, rhythmic pulse, a vast expanse of turquoise and indigo that has watched the rise and fall of countless empires without ever changing its own expression. To look out across its waters is to stare into a mirror of deep time, a place where the boundary between the world we know and the world that has been forgotten becomes thin and permeable. Beneath that shimmering surface lies a silent kingdom of salt and silt, where the wreckage of the ancient world rests in a perpetual twilight, and it is here, in the cold embrace of the depths, that history often hides its most uncomfortable truths. We like to believe that progress is a straight line, a steady climb from the primitive to the sophisticated, but the sea tells a different story. It speaks of cycles, of heights reached and then lost, of technologies that flourished in the shadows of antiquity only to vanish for 2,000 years, leaving us to wonder how much of our own story has been erased by the currents. In the spring of the year 1900, the world was beginning to accelerate into a new century of steam and steel, yet the rhythms of the Mediterranean remained much as they had been for generations. A small fleet of 2 Greek boats, manned by sponge divers from the island of Symi, was making its way back from the coast of North Africa. These men lived by the ancient laws of the water, descending into the crushing pressure of the deep to harvest the soft, porous treasures of the seabed. Their lives were measured in breaths held and the slow, steady pull of the tide. But as they neared the small, rocky island of Antikythera, a jagged tooth of stone rising from the sea, between Crete and the Peloponnese, the atmosphere began to shift. The sky, once a brilliant, clear blue, bruised into a deep, threatening violet. The wind began to howl through the rigging, and the waves grew into white-capped mountains that threatened to swallow the small wooden vessels whole. Seeking refuge from the violent storm, the captain, Demetrios Kondos, ordered his men to drop anchor in the lee of the island, near a place called Point Glyphadia. They waited for the tempest to pass, huddling together as the timber groaned and the rain lashed the deck. It was a moment of forced stillness, a pause in their journey that would soon change the course of archaeology forever. When the storm finally broke and the waters regained a deceptive calm, the divers decided to explore the area, hoping perhaps to find a fresh bed of sponges to make their detour profitable. One man, Elias Stadiatis, donned the heavy copper helmet and the canvas suit of the era, a primitive, weighted garment that felt more like a prison than a diving suit. As he was lowered into the emerald gloom, he had no way of knowing that he was about to step out of his own time and into a graveyard of the classical world. As you settle into your blankets and find a comfortable position for the night, you are in exactly the right place to let these mysteries of the past wash over you. Here at the Slumber Archives, we explore the quiet corners of history and the enigmas of lost civilizations every single day, weaving narrations designed to help you drift into a deep and restful sleep. If you find peace in these stories, I invite you to subscribe so that we can journey together through the shadows of time every night. A simple like on this video also helps others find their way to our quiet archives. Now let us return to the cold, dark waters off the coast of Antikythera. Elias Stadiatis descended through the water column, the light from above fading into a dim, ghostly green. At a depth of approximately 150 feet, just at the limit of what a man could endure in those days, his lead-soled boots finally touched the seafloor. But he did not find the soft, sandy bottom he expected. Instead, as the silt cleared, he found himself standing in the midst of a nightmare. He signaled frantically to be pulled up, and when he finally broke the surface and his helmet was removed, he was trembling, his face pale with a primal kind of terror. He gasped out a description of what he had seen, a vision of horror resting in the silt. He spoke of heaps of dead bodies, rotting, distorted limbs of men and horses scattered across the sand, as if a great massacre had taken place beneath the waves. The captain, skeptical but intrigued, donned the suit himself and descended into the same dark patch of ocean. What he found was not a massacre, but something far more surreal. The dead bodies Stadiatis had seen were not flesh and bone, but bronze and marble. They were statues, exquisite, life-sized figures from the golden age of Greece that had been worn smooth by 2,000 years of salt and sand. Some were missing limbs, others were encrusted with thick layers of calcareous growth, giving them a skeletal decaying appearance that would easily deceive a frightened diver in the dim light. They were the silent passengers of a massive Roman grain ship that had foundered against the rocks of Antikythera in the 1st century before the Common Era, a vessel carrying a cargo of unimaginable wealth, destined perhaps for a triumphal parade in Rome, but claimed instead by the sea. Among the scattered limbs of heroes and the shattered hulls of amphorae lay a small, unassuming lump of oxidized bronze. It was no larger than a shoebox, heavily encrusted with sea life and corroded into a green, stony mass. To the divers, it looked like nothing more than a piece of the ship's machinery or a discarded fragment of a larger sculpture. They hauled it to the surface along with the magnificent statues of gods and athletes, unaware that this calcified fragment held a secret that would challenge everything we thought we knew about the ancient mind. For decades, it sat in a museum, overlooked and uncleaned, its true nature hidden behind a veil of corrosion. It is a strange thing to consider how much of our history depends on such accidents: a storm, a nervous diver, a forgotten box. We often think of archaeology as a precise science of stratigraphy, the study of rock layers to determine the age of remains, and radiocarbon dating, which measures the decay of carbon atoms to tell us when a living thing died. But at its heart, it is a search for the ghosts of a civilization that may have been far more advanced than we dare to admit. The Antikythera shipwreck represents a puncture in the narrative of human progress. It suggests that the ancients possessed a level of mechanical sophistication that, according to the standard history books, should not have existed for another 1,500 years. As we look back through the fog of deep time, we must ask ourselves how many other computers lie buried in the silt, and how many times humanity has reached for the stars, only to be pulled back down into the depths of a forgotten age. The scent of brine and the rhythmic slap of the Aegean against the hull of the Sophia were the only constants for the men who first dared to pull secrets from the floor of the Antikythera Strait. It was the spring of 1901, a time when the world was beginning to accelerate into a new century, yet these sponge divers were about to be pulled backward into a past they could scarcely comprehend. The Greek government, recognizing the gravity of the initial find, dispatched the Hellenic navy to assist these humble mariners, creating an unlikely alliance between state power and the seasoned, salt-crusted wisdom of the deep-sea divers. Together, they anchored over the graveyard of a Roman grain ship, a massive vessel that had been swallowed by the waves 2 millennia prior, carrying a cargo that would rewrite the lineage of human thought. The work was grueling, a slow dance with death conducted in the twilight of the Mediterranean depths. These men did not have the sleek, lightweight equipment of the modern era. Instead, they descended in heavy, copper-helmeted diving suits, encased in canvas and rubber that felt like a tomb before they even broke the surface. Air was delivered through a manual pump on the deck, a rhythmic huffing sound that served as the heartbeat for the man below. At depths of nearly 200 feet, the pressure was a physical weight, pressing against their lungs and clouding their minds with the strange, euphoric fog of nitrogen narcosis. They could only remain on the bottom for a few minutes at a time, their fingers groping through the silt and the darkness, feeling for the cold touch of stone or the rough texture of oxidized metal. Each ascent was a gamble with the bends, a painful and often fatal condition where nitrogen bubbles form in the blood, yet the allure of what lay beneath kept them returning to the silent pressure of the abyss. As the weeks turned into months, the deck of the recovery ship began to resemble a surreal garden of ghosts. They pulled up statues of marble and bronze, figures that had once stood in the sun-drenched villas of the Roman elite, now transformed by their long immersion in the saline dark. The marble statues were particularly haunting. The sides that had been buried in the protective silt remained smooth and white, but the surfaces exposed to the seawater had been ravaged by lithophaga, tiny, rock-boring mollusks. These creatures had pitted the stone, leaving the faces of heroes and gods looking like victims of a terrible, stony leprosy. To see a majestic likeness of Hermes or Odysseus, with half his face eaten away by the slow hunger of the sea, is to witness the true scale of deep time. It is a reminder that even our most enduring monuments are eventually reclaimed by the elements. Among these eroded giants were bronzes of exquisite detail, their surfaces coated in a thick green patina that spoke of centuries in the cradle of the current. The divers hauled up heavy ceramic jars called amphorae, which had once held wine, oil, or grain, now filled only with the mud of the sea floor. Each object was a fragment of a lost world, a piece of a puzzle that seemed to suggest a ship of immense proportions and even greater wealth. The sheer scale of the recovery effort was unprecedented in the history of archaeology. It was the first major underwater excavation of its kind, conducted with primitive tools, but fueled by a profound sense of wonder. The divers, many of whom suffered permanent injury or paralysis from the repeated deep dives, spoke of the wreck as if it were a living thing, a giant carcass of wood and bronze that held its secrets with a stubborn, crushing grip. The physical toll was immense. One diver lost his life and 2 others were permanently disabled, their bodies broken by the very pressure that preserved the artifacts they sought. It was a high price to pay for the remnants of a forgotten voyage, yet as the artifacts were transported to the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, the world began to realize that the Antikythera wreck was not merely a collection of art. Hidden amongst the monumental statues and the piles of pottery was a small, unassuming lump of corroded bronze and wood, no larger than a shoebox. It was green, calcified, and seemingly insignificant compared to the graceful limbs of the bronze Antikythera youth that had captivated the public's imagination. For months, this fragment sat in a storage crate, drying out, its internal structures slowly cracking as the moisture left its ancient pores. It was only by chance, nearly a year after its recovery, that an archaeologist noticed something strange about this particular piece of debris. As the outer casing began to split, it revealed the unmistakable teeth of a gear. It was a sight that should have been impossible. The history of technology, as it was understood then, dictated that complex, interlocking gearwork did not appear in the human record until the clocks of the late Middle Ages, over 1,000 years after this ship had foundered. And yet, there it was, a mechanical heart beating from the depths of the 1st century before the Common Era. This discovery would eventually force a confrontation with the limits of our knowledge, suggesting that the path of human progress is not a straight line, but a series of peaks and valleys, where great heights are reached and then utterly forgotten, buried by the silt of time and the indifference of the waves. The collaborative effort between the divers and the Navy had succeeded in bringing the physical past to the surface, but the intellectual past proved much harder to salvage. As the scholars leaned over the green, crumbling fragments of the mechanism, they were looking at a ghost of a science that had no right to exist in the world of the ancients. They saw inscriptions, tiny Greek letters barely visible to the naked eye, etched into the bronze plates like the fine print of a contract with the stars. These were not the markings of a simple tool, but the instructions for a device that calculated the very movements of the heavens. It makes one wonder how many other such devices were lost to the flames of the Library of Alexandria or melted down for scrap during the long, dark centuries that followed the fall of the classical world. The Antikythera wreck remains a testament to the fragility of human achievement. We often think of our history as a steady climb, an accumulation of wisdom that builds upon itself until we reach the modern age. But the sight of those divers, gasping for air as they hauled up the shattered remains of a prehistoric computer, suggests a different story. It suggests that we are a species that forgets as much as it learns. The sea, in its cold and silent depths, acts as a vault, preserving the things we were not ready to keep in the light of day. As we contemplate the eroded faces of the statues and the intricate, calcified gears of the mechanism, we are reminded that deep time is not just a measure of years, but a measure of the distance between what we once knew and what we have been forced to rediscover. The journey of the Antikythera mechanism from the seabed to the museum was only the beginning. The real work lay in trying to understand the minds of the people who could dream of such a thing and then, inexplicably, let it slip beneath the waves. The silence of a museum at dawn is a peculiar thing, a stillness that feels heavy with the weight of uncounted centuries. In the spring of 1902, the National Archaeological Museum in Athens was not yet the bustling corridor of tourism it would become. It was a quiet storehouse, a place where the salt-crusted remnants of the Antikythera wreck were being slowly cleaned and catalogued. Among the towering marble figures and the elegant bronze limbs of gods was a collection of smaller, less impressive fragments. They looked like nothing more than charred wood or perhaps chunks of fossilized sea floor, shapeless, greenish-grey lumps that had been pulled from the silt and left to dry in the Mediterranean air. It was on the 18th of May that Valerios Stais, a dedicated archaeologist and a man accustomed to the patient rhythms of his craft, noticed something that everyone else had overlooked. As he moved through the storage rooms, his eyes fell upon a particular mass of calcified material that had begun to crack. The change in environment, the transition from the crushing, cold pressure of the sea floor to the dry, sun-drenched atmosphere of the museum had caused the material to shrink and split. It was a natural process of decay, a shedding of its protective skin, but what lay beneath the crust was enough to make the world of classical history shudder. Stais leaned in closer, perhaps squinting through the dust motes dancing in the light, and saw the impossible. There, embedded in the heart of the stone-like mass, was a bronze gear wheel. It was tiny, delicate, and possessed teeth so fine and precisely cut that they seemed to belong to the workshop of an 18th-century watchmaker rather than a Roman-era shipwreck. Beside it, peering through the green corrosion, were faint traces of Greek inscriptions, letters carved with such miniaturized precision that they defied the known capabilities of ancient tools. The moment the mass split open was like a tear in the fabric of time itself. For a brief second, the linear progression of human progress, the comforting story we tell ourselves about how technology moves slowly from the primitive to the complex, was revealed to be a fragile illusion. Stais was looking at a machine, a mechanical device of such sophistication that it shouldn't have existed for another 1,000 years. And yet, there it was, resting in his hand, a ghost from a forgotten peak of human ingenuity. As the news of the discovery began to ripple through the scientific community, the initial reaction was not one of wonder, but of profound skepticism. The gears were too perfect. The complexity was too great. Many scholars, tethered to the established chronologies of the early 20th century, simply refused to believe that the Greeks of the 1st century before the Common Era could have produced such a thing. They suggested that perhaps it was a much later addition to the wreck, perhaps a navigational instrument dropped by a passing ship centuries after the original disaster. They looked for any explanation that would preserve the status quo, any theory that would allow them to ignore the uncomfortable reality of the bronze wheels. In those early days, the mechanism was treated almost like an intruder in the museum. It didn't fit the narrative of the noble primitive or the philosophical Greek who dealt in ideas rather than cold, hard engineering. We often forget that archaeology is not just the study of objects, but the study of our own assumptions. When we find something that exceeds our expectations of the past, our first instinct is often to reject it, to call it an anomaly or a mistake of stratigraphy, the layering of soil and time that helps us date the remnants of the dead. But the inscriptions on the mechanism were undeniable. They were written in a style of Greek common to the era of the shipwreck, and as the calcified layers continued to flake away, more wheels were revealed, an entire forest of bronze teeth, stacked and layered in a way that suggested a deep mathematical intent. The skepticism of the experts began to take on a desperate quality. If this device was truly ancient, then the history of technology was not a steady climb, but a jagged mountain range with peaks that had been lost in the clouds of deep time. The mechanism sat in its glass case, a silent witness to this intellectual struggle. It was a lump of bronze in the sun, slowly revealing its secrets through the simple act of existing. To look at it was to realize that we are not the first to reach for the stars with gears and calculations. We are merely the latest. The people who built this device understood the movements of the heavens with a clarity that we usually reserve for the age of the telescope and the computer. They had mapped the cycles of the moon, the paths of the planets, and the timing of eclipses into a box no larger than a mantle clock. As the decades passed, the mystery only deepened. The more the scientists looked, the more they realized that the Antikythera Mechanism was not an isolated invention, but the pinnacle of a tradition that had vanished almost without a trace. It was as if we had found a single page from a lost encyclopedia, a hint of a vast library of knowledge that had been burned or buried or simply forgotten. We are forced to wonder how many other wonders lie at the bottom of the sea or beneath the sands of the desert, waiting for the right moment to split open and show us who we really were. The weight of this realization is heavy, like the pressure of the deep water that once held the mechanism fast. It suggests that human history is a cycle of forgetting and remembering, a long, slow breathing of the spirit where entire civilizations can rise to heights of brilliance only to be swallowed by the dark. The gears of Antikythera are more than just bronze. They are a reminder that the distance between us and the ancients is not measured in intelligence, but in the fragile survival of what we leave behind. Consider the mind that first drew the blueprints for those teeth. Imagine the workshop, the smell of charcoal and hot metal, the steady scrape of the file as a craftsman shaped the bronze to match the mathematics of the cosmos. That person died 2,000 years ago, and their name is lost to the winds. But their thoughts remain, frozen in the corrosion, waiting for a museum curator in Athens to notice a crack in the crust. It is a haunting thought, a whisper from the depths that tells us we are not as unique as we like to believe. And so, the mechanism remained in the museum, a puzzle that no one could quite solve, a challenge to every historian who walked past it. It was a splinter in the mind of science, a constant nagging question. If they could do this, what else could they do? And why did they stop? The answers were not to be found in the bronze itself, but in the long, slow process of looking deeper, using tools that Valerios Stais could never have imagined. X-rays, gamma rays, and digital reconstructions that would eventually peel back the layers of time without ever touching the fragile metal. But for now, in those early years of the 20th century, the device was simply a miracle in a box. It was a reminder that the sun which shines on the ruins of Athens today is the same sun that once glinted off the polished bronze of the mechanism when it was new, before the storm, before the wreck, before the long sleep in the silt. The journey of understanding was only just beginning, and the path would lead us into the very heart of the ancient world's most guarded secrets, secrets that were never meant to be found, yet could not remain hidden forever. The scent of cedar wood and salted hemp hung heavy in the humid air of the Aegean harbours as the great merchant ship prepared for its final departure. It was a vessel of staggering proportions for its time, a hulking grain carrier repurposed for a far more precious cargo, its hull reinforced with lead sheathing to withstand the unpredictable moods of the wine-dark sea. Somewhere between 70 and 60 BC the ship sat low in the water, its hold teeming with the spoils of a world in transition. The Roman Republic was expanding its reach like a rising tide, and its appetite for the refinements of the Greek East was insatiable. We can imagine the scene at the docks of Asia Minor, perhaps at Pergamon or the bustling port of Ephesus, where the rhythmic thud of crates being lowered into the hold echoed against the stone quays. This was not a cargo of necessity, but one of profound luxury. There were towering marble statues, their features carved with such delicate precision that they seemed to breathe in the flickering torchlight. There were bronze figures, lithe and athletic, cast with a mastery that the world would not see again for over 1,000 years. There were amphorae filled with the finest oils and wines, and sets of exquisite glassware that shimmered like captured sunlight. The ship was essentially a floating museum, a concentrated essence of Hellenistic genius destined for the villas of the Roman elite, who sought to drape their newfound power in the prestige of an older, more sophisticated culture. As the crew unfurled the great linen sails, the ship began its slow, heavy crawl toward the Italian peninsula. The route was a familiar one, hugging the coastlines and hopping between the emerald gems of the islands. Yet the sea is a fickle guardian of secrets. The weight of the cargo made the vessel sluggish, a giant moving through a labyrinth of currents and hidden reefs. Among the statues of gods and the crates of pottery lay a small, unassuming wooden box. It was no larger than a shoebox, perhaps tucked away in a corner of the captain's cabin, or stored among the most delicate instruments of navigation. Inside, the bronze gears of the Antikythera Mechanism rested in silence, their teeth interlocking with a mathematical perfection that mirrored the very movements of the heavens. The voyage likely began under clear skies, the stars that the mechanism was designed to track guiding the mariners through the night. But as they neared the treacherous waters off the southern tip of the Peloponnese, the atmosphere began to shift. The ancient Mediterranean is known for its sudden, violent storms, the Gregale and the Sirocco, that can turn a placid turquoise expanse into a churning cauldron of grey foam in a matter of hours. Somewhere near the tiny, rugged island of Antikythera, the ship met its fate. We can only speculate on those final moments. The frantic shouting of the sailors nearly drowned out by the howling wind, the desperate attempts to shed weight by casting precious cargo into the abyss, and the terrifying sound of the massive hull groaning as it was driven toward the jagged rocks. The ship did not merely sink, it plummeted. The sheer weight of the marble and bronze pulled it down through the dark, cold layers of the sea, settling on a steep underwater slope at a depth of nearly 60 meters. As the vessel came to rest, the silt of 2 millennia began its slow, patient work. The wood of the hull was gradually consumed by the sea, leaving the heavy cargo to settle into the seabed like a graveyard of a forgotten age. The silence that followed was absolute. Above, the Roman Empire would rise to its zenith and eventually crumble into the dust of history. The Middle Ages would pass in a flicker of candlelight, and the Renaissance would begin to rediscover the very art that lay rotting in the deep. Yet, for 2,000 years, the mechanism remained in the dark, its gears frozen mid-calculation, a masterpiece of ancient engineering lost to the memory of man. There is a haunting quality to the thought of that ship sitting in the perpetual twilight of the seafloor, while the world above changed beyond recognition. The men who built the mechanism, the astronomers who calculated its cycles, and the merchants who hoped to profit from its sale were all long gone, their names erased by the passage of deep time. We often think of history as a continuous thread, a steady progression of knowledge and capability, but the Antikythera wreck suggests a different story, one of sudden ruptures and lost heights. It represents a peak of technological achievement that was swallowed by the waves, leaving those who came after to wonder at the fragments. The silt acted as a preservative, a cold shroud that protected the bronze from the worst ravages of the salt water, though it could not stop the steady march of mineralization. The mechanism became a concretion, a green, stony lump that looked more like a natural rock than a pinnacle of human ingenuity. It waited there, nestled among the headless statues and the shattered pottery, while the currents of the Mediterranean whispered over it. The shipwreck was a time capsule, a moment of the 1st century BCE frozen in a state of suspended animation. It was a repository of the Greek mind, reflecting a deep understanding of the cosmos that seemed almost anachronistic when it was finally rediscovered. As we contemplate the Ill-Fated Voyage, we are forced to confront the limits of our own archaeological record. How many other vessels, laden with wonders we cannot even imagine, lie hidden in the deep trenches of the world's oceans? The Antikythera ship was likely just one of many, a single thread in a vast web of trade and intellectual exchange that spanned the known world. Its loss was a tragedy for the owners and the crew, but for us, it became a bridge across time. The storm that destroyed the ship also served to protect its contents from the recycling fires of the later centuries, where bronze was often melted down for weapons or tools. The sea became a sanctuary of sorts, a place where the past could hide until a new age was ready to decode its mysteries. The journey from Asia Minor toward Rome was intended to be a triumph of commerce, a display of wealth and sophistication. Instead, it became a testament to the fragility of human endeavor. The silence that followed the wreck lasted for 2,000 years, a span of time so vast that it encompasses nearly the entirety of what we call modern civilization. During those centuries, the mechanism sat in the dark, its internal calendar still marking the theoretical positions of planets it could no longer see, and the dates of eclipses that occurred in an empty sky. It was a ghost of a machine, waiting for a light that would not come for 20 centuries. When we look back at the path the ship took, we see more than just a trade route. We see the movement of ideas. The mechanism was the culmination of centuries of Greek mathematical thought, from the geometric theories of Euclid to the astronomical observations of Hipparchus. It was a physical manifestation of a world view that saw the universe as an orderly, predictable system, a cosmos in the truest sense of the Greek word. The fact that such a device was being transported as a luxury good for a Roman patron tells us much about the value placed on intellectual mastery in the ancient world. It was a prize of the highest order, a jewel of the mine that was never delivered. And so, the ship remained in its watery grave, a silent witness to the passing of ages. The fish swam through the ribs of its rotted hull, and the pressure of the deep pressed down on the statues of heroes and gods. The world above forgot that such a thing as the Antikythera Mechanism had ever existed. It became a myth, a legend of a golden age of technology that many later historians would have dismissed as impossible had the wreck not been found. The discovery, when it finally came, would not be the result of a deliberate search, but a chance encounter in the dark, a moment where the modern world finally brushed against the cold, calcified skin of a past it had long since outgrown. The voyage was over, but the story of the ship and its mysterious passenger was only just beginning to be told. The initial silence surrounding the bronze fragments was not born of indifference, but of a deep collective disorientation. In those early years of the 20th century, the scholars at the National Archaeological Museum in Athens looked upon the calcified remains with a sense of profound unease, as if they had pulled a piece of the future out of the deep, distant past. They saw the jagged edges and the faint, ghostly outlines of gears, and they found themselves standing at a crossroads of interpretation. Some, clinging to the established timelines of human progress, argued that the device was surely an astrolabe, a relatively common instrument used by later Islamic and European astronomers to tell time and calculate the positions of the stars. It was a safe explanation, one that kept the history of the world neatly organized and predictable. But others, those who looked closer at the density of the teeth and the complexity of the layering, sensed something far more unsettling. They saw a machine that did not belong to the era of the simple astrolabe, a machine that hinted at a level of mechanical sophistication that was not supposed to exist for another 1,000 years. The debate hummed quietly in the halls of academia, a slow-burning friction between what was known and what was seen. To accept the device as a complex computer meant rewriting the entire narrative of ancient Greek engineering. It meant acknowledging that the people of the first century before the Common Era possessed a mastery of mathematics and metallurgy that had somehow been completely erased from the subsequent historical record. There were no manuals for such a device in the Great Library of Alexandria, no blueprints etched into the marble of the Acropolis. In the eyes of the skeptics, the Antikythera Mechanism was an impossibility, a phantom of bronze that defied the very laws of cultural evolution. They pointed to the lack of comparable technology in any other shipwreck, any other tomb, or any other excavation site across the Mediterranean. If the Greeks could build this, they asked, why was the world not filled with the ticking of gears and the hum of bronze machinery? Why did the trail go cold for a millennium? And so, as the decades began to drift by like silt settling on the ocean floor, the fragments were moved from the laboratory tables to the shadows of museum storage. They were placed in wooden boxes, tucked away in the cool, dim basements where the air smelled of dust and ancient stone. It is a strange thing to consider that one of the most significant technological discoveries in human history spent nearly 50 years as a footnote, a curiosity that no one quite knew how to categorize. The world was busy with its own mechanical revolutions, the rise of the internal combustion engine, the birth of flight, the dark machinery of 2 world wars. While the modern world pushed forward with steel and oil, the ancient bronze gears sat in total stillness, their secrets locked behind layers of corrosion that no tool of the time could safely penetrate. The technology required to understand the device simply did not exist yet. It was as if the mechanism was waiting, patiently biding its time until a generation arrived with the eyes to see it properly. During this long period of neglect, the fragments grew more fragile, the bronze slowly reacting with the air of the surface world, a process far different from the slow calcification of the deep. To the curators of the mid-20th century, the pieces looked like nothing more than charred bits of wood or scrap metal, hardly worth the precious display space reserved for the smooth, white marble of the Hellenistic statues. The statues spoke a language the world understood, the language of beauty, anatomy, and myth. But the mechanism spoke in the language of mathematics and hidden ratios, a dialect that had been forgotten by the very civilization that birthed it. It was a relic of a lost intellectual lineage, a branch of the human tree that had been pruned away by time and catastrophe. As the years passed, a few lonely voices continued to wonder about the mystery in the basement. They would visit the fragments, peering through magnifying glasses at the faint inscriptions that danced across the bronze surfaces like the legs of tiny insects. These inscriptions were the keys, yet they were tantalizingly incomplete, broken off mid-sentence or obscured by the relentless grip of the sea. The skeptics remained firm, suggesting the device was perhaps a late addition to the wreck or a singular fluke of history that didn't represent a broader scientific culture. They could not conceive of a world where ancient philosophers walked alongside gear cutters and master clockmakers. To them, the ancient world was one of poetry and politics, not of precision engineering and predictive modeling. Meanwhile, the fragments themselves seemed to possess a heavy, silent gravity. Even in storage, they represented a challenge to the human ego, a reminder that our ancestors may have reached heights we are only now beginning to map. The lack of comparable technology in the historical record acts as a kind of shadow, a dark space in our collective memory, where an entire tradition of mechanical wisdom once flourished and then vanished. We are used to history being a steady climb, a ladder where each rung leads logically to the next. But the Antikythera Mechanism suggests a different shape to time, a series of peaks and valleys where great leaps of understanding can be made, only to be swallowed by the earth or the sea, leaving those who follow to start again from nothing. It was not until the 1950s that the tide began to turn, as new eyes and new minds began to look at the fragments with a different kind of curiosity. The mechanical age was maturing into the electronic age, and as we began to build our own computers, we finally gained the perspective necessary to recognize one from the ancient past. Yet, even then, the skepticism lingered like a morning mist that refuses to burn away. The idea that a hand-cranked box could calculate the movements of the heavens with such terrifying accuracy felt like a story from a Borges tale or a dream whispered by a ghost. The fragments sat in their boxes, the bronze turning a deep sea-dark green, waiting for the first rays of X-ray light to pierce their exterior and reveal the ghost in the machine. As we contemplate those 50 years of waiting, we are reminded of how much of our history remains hidden, not because it is lost, but because we do not yet have the language to describe it. The Antikythera Mechanism was there all along, resting in the quiet of the museum, a silent witness to our own evolving understanding of the past. It did not change, but we did. And as the technology of the 20th century finally caught up to the technology of the first century before the Common Era, the stage was set for a revelation that would shake the foundations of archaeology. The gears were ready to turn once more, if only in the minds of those who dared to look beyond the surface of the corroded metal. The long sleep of the mechanism was coming to an end, and the story it had to tell was far more complex and far more beautiful than anyone had ever dared to imagine. The air in the laboratories of the mid-20th century was often thick with the scent of ozone and the quiet hum of vacuum tubes, a world away from the salt-sprayed decks of the Aegean. It was the year 1951, when a physicist and historian of science named Derek de Sola Price first laid eyes on the fragments in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. He did not see merely a curiosity of the ancient world or a strange fossil of a forgotten voyage. He saw a challenge to the very timeline of human ingenuity. Price was a man who understood the language of machines, and he suspected that the green, calcified lumps held a grammar of movement that had been lost for 2 millennia. For decades, the mechanism had been treated as a surface-level puzzle, its secrets guarded by the thick crust of mineral deposits that had grown over it like a protective cocoon in the crushing depths of the sea. To peer inside without destroying the fragile bronze was thought impossible until Price turned to the invisible spectrum of light. Using early forms of X-ray and gamma-ray imaging, he began to peel back the layers of time, not with a chisel, but with radiation. As the first grainy images emerged from the darkroom, the shadows of the past began to take a definitive, geometric shape. What appeared on those plates was a revelation that defied the established history of technology. Deep within the heart of the largest fragment, hidden beneath an inch of stone and oxidized metal, Price discovered the ghosts of 30 distinct gear wheels. They were not crude or oversized. They were delicate, with teeth cut into precise triangles, arranged in a dense and purposeful architecture. It was a moment of profound stillness in the laboratory. The realization that the ancient Greeks had mastered the art of the gear long before the clockmakers of the Renaissance were even a dream in the mind of history. As Price traced the interlocking teeth of these spectral wheels, he began to calculate the ratios of their rotation. He realized that this was not a simple toy or a navigational compass, but a mechanical computer of staggering sophistication. By turning a single crank, a user could set the entire system in motion, simulating the complex rhythms of the heavens. The gears were designed to track the movements of the sun and the moon, to predict eclipses with mathematical certainty, and to follow the erratic dance of the 5 planets known to the ancients. It was a device that translated the vast, eternal cycles of the cosmos into the palm of a human hand. The implications were as heavy as the lead weights used by the sponge divers who had first found the wreck. If such a machine existed in the 1st century before the Common Era, it meant that the lineage of scientific thought was far older and more continuous than anyone had dared to suggest. It pointed to a lost tradition of high-precision engineering, a school of thought that had flourished in the shadows of the Great Library, or the workshops of Rhodes, only to be swallowed by the waves and forgotten as the classical world slowly dissolved into the Middle Ages. Price's work with X-rays allowed him to see the stratigraphy of the machine, a term usually reserved for the layers of Earth in an archaeological dig, but here applied to the internal layers of a single object. He saw how the gears were stacked, how pins and slots were used to create a variable motion that could account for the moon's uneven speed as it moved through its elliptical orbit. This was a level of mechanical radiocarbon dating for the mind. It proved that the intellectual climate of the ancient Mediterranean was capable of producing devices that would not be seen again for another 1,500 years. As the images became clearer, Price noted the presence of tiny inscriptions, letters barely a few millimeters tall, etched into the bronze plates. These were the user manuals of antiquity, instructions for how to read the dials and understand the celestial movements the machine was performing. The device was a bridge between the abstract mathematics of the philosophers and the tangible world of the craftsman. It was a physical manifestation of the music of the spheres, a silent, spinning proof that the universe operated on laws that could be measured, modeled, and mastered. The discovery of 30 gears was only the beginning. Price suspected there were many more, perhaps dozens of smaller wheels that had been lost to the currents, or remained hidden in the smaller, unexamined fragments. The X-rays provided a map, but the territory was still vast and largely unexplored. The mechanism was a ghost ship of information, sailing through the centuries to deliver a message about the true height of our ancestors' reach. It suggested that history does not always move in a straight line of progress, but in great sweeping cycles, where knowledge is gained, cherished, and then inexplicably lost to the deep. In the quiet of the museum, the fragments remained still, but in the mind of Derek de Solla Price, the gears were turning with a frantic, beautiful energy. He spoke of the device as if it were a Grecian clock, yet it was so much more. It was a calculator of destiny, a tool for priests and astronomers to peer into the future and look back into the past. The revelation of its internal complexity began to change the way we viewed the dark ages that followed, making them seem even darker by comparison to the brilliant gear-driven light of the world that had preceded them. As the 1950s drew to a close, the world of archaeology was forced to reckon with the ghost in the machine. The Antikythera Mechanism was no longer a fluke or a misidentified modern artifact. It was the most sophisticated object to survive from the ancient world. The X-ray breakthrough had cracked the case wide open, but it also raised a haunting question that would linger for decades. If the Greeks could build a computer, what else had they built? And where were the other machines? Perhaps they were still out there, resting in the silt of 1,000 shipwrecks, waiting for the light of a future century to find them. The work of Price provided the first true blueprint of the mechanism's soul. He saw the way the large four-spoked wheel at the front drove the smaller gears in the back, creating a chain reaction of logic that mirrored the clockwork of the solar system. He marveled at the differential gear, a component previously thought to have been invented in the 18th century, yet there it was, resting in a bed of Aegean limestone, 2,000 years old. It was a humbling reminder of the limits of our own knowledge and the enduring mystery of the things we have forgotten. The story of the X-ray breakthrough is a story of looking beneath the surface, of refusing to accept that the visible world is all there is. It teaches us that time is a heavy veil, but one that can be pierced with patience and the right kind of light. As the fragments were returned to their velvet-lined boxes, they carried with them a new identity. They were no longer just the find from Antikythera. They were the first computer, a masterpiece of bronze and brilliance that had survived the crushing weight of the sea to remind us of who we once were and what we were once capable of imagining. To understand the true nature of this bronze enigma, one must first look away from the gears themselves and gaze upward toward the steady, silent dance of the night sky. The ancients did not view the heavens as a chaotic void, but as a grand rhythmic clock, a tapestry of cycles within cycles that dictated the planting of crops, the timing of festivals, and the very heartbeat of their civilization. Inside the corroded shell of the Antikythera Mechanism, this celestial rhythm was captured in metal, translated from the vastness of the cosmos into the palm of a human hand. At the core of this mechanical universe lies the metonic cycle, a 19-year period that harmonizes the movements of the sun and the moon. It was a discovery of profound importance attributed to the Greek astronomer Meton of Athens in the 5th century before the Common Era. He realized that 19 solar years are almost exactly equal to 235 lunar months. This meant that after 19 years, the phases of the moon would recur on the same days of the solar year, a mathematical bridge between two worlds that often seemed at odds. The makers of the device did not merely know of this cycle, they engraved it into the very soul of the machine. One of the large dials on the back of the mechanism tracked this 19-year progression with a spiraling groove, allowing a user to predict the lunar calendar with a precision that seems almost impossible for an era we often dismiss as primitive. As we peer closer into the ghost-like images provided by modern X-rays, we see how this cycle was achieved. It was not through simple luck, but through the calculated arrangement of gear ratios that reflect a deep, almost spiritual understanding of mathematics. To represent the metonic cycle, the craftsman had to create a train of gears that could divide and multiply motion with the exactitude of a modern wristwatch. They were calculating the synodic month, the time it takes for the moon to return to the same position relative to the sun, roughly 29.5 days, and they were doing so by connecting wheels of bronze that had to mesh perfectly, without the aid of standardized industrial tools. The precision of these gears is where the mystery truly deepens, touching the limits of what we believe was possible in the 2nd century before the Common Era. Some of these gear teeth are as small as 1 millimeter. Imagine, if you will, a workshop lit only by oil lamps and the soft glow of a forge, where a master artisan sits with a steady hand and a sharp tool, hand-cutting dozens of triangular teeth into a bronze disc. Each tooth must be angled just so, for if a single one was slightly out of alignment, the entire mechanical universe would jam, the sun would stall in its tracks, and the moon would fall out of phase. This level of miniaturization suggests a lineage of technology that has been entirely lost to history, a tradition of fine mechanics that must have existed for centuries before reaching such a peak of perfection. And so, We find ourselves wandering through a landscape of gears that behave like the thoughts of a mathematician made physical. The device did not just track the days, it tracked the very positions of the sun and the moon as they wandered through the zodiac. It accounted for the moon's elliptical orbit, which causes it to appear to speed up and slow down in the sky, a phenomenon known as lunar anomaly. To replicate this, the creators used a pin and slot mechanism, where one gear sits slightly off-center on another, joined by a tiny pin that slides back and forth. This subtle, elegant trick of geometry allowed the machine to mimic the irregular pulse of the heavens, a level of sophistication that would not reappear in Europe for another 1400 years. It is a humbling thought to realize that while the rest of the world was struggling with the basic tools of survival, someone, somewhere, was calculating the secrets of the spheres with the precision of a master horologist. We often think of progress as a straight line, a steady climb from the darkness of the past into the light of the present, but the Antikythera Mechanism suggests a different story. It suggests a peak of achievement that was reached and then forgotten, a brilliant flame that was extinguished by the cold waters of the Mediterranean, leaving behind only these calcified fragments to haunt our understanding of history. The math within the bronze is not just about numbers, it is about the human desire to find order in the infinite. By turning a small hand crank on the side of the box, a person could move through time, watching the cycles of the moon wax and wane, predicting eclipses with terrifying accuracy, and seeing the positions of the known planets as they drifted against the backdrop of the stars. It was a way to hold the infinite in one's lap, to see the future and the past as a single, interconnected web of motion. As we contemplate the tiny teeth and the complex ratios, we are forced to ask, how many other wonders have been claimed by time? If such a device could be built 2,000 years ago, what else was lost when the great libraries burned or the ships sank beneath the waves? The sea is a vast archive of forgotten dreams, and the Antikythera Mechanism is perhaps just one page from a book we can no longer read. It stands as a silent witness to a level of genius that defies the standard narrative of human development, a reminder that the deep past is not a place of simplicity, but a realm of hidden complexities that we are only just beginning to rediscover. In the quiet of the museum, where the fragments now rest, one can almost hear the faint, ghostly ticking of those bronze wheels. They speak of a time when the stars were not just distant points of light, but a language that could be translated into metal. They remind us that even in the face of the crushing weight of the ocean and the passage of millennia, the truth of the cosmos remains constant, waiting for someone with the patience to look, the wisdom to calculate, and the courage to imagine the impossible. To understand the mind that conceived of such a machine, we must look away from the rusted bronze and toward the night sky as it appeared over 2,000 years ago. In the 2nd century before the Common Era, a man named Hipparchus lived on the island of Rhodes, a place where the air was thick with the scent of salt and wild thyme. He spent his nights watching the slow, deliberate dance of the planets, recording their movements with a precision that seems almost impossible for an age without lenses. It is his intellectual shadow that falls most clearly across the Antikythera Mechanism, for he was the one who wrestled most fiercely with the stubborn irregularities of the heavens. The Greeks observed something deeply troubling about the moon and the planets. They did not move in perfect, simple circles. Sometimes they seemed to speed up, at other times they lingered, and occasionally they appeared to move backward against the tapestry of the stars. In a universe that was supposed to be governed by divine harmony, these deviations were a riddle that demanded an answer. Hipparchus, perhaps the greatest astronomer of antiquity, proposed a solution that was as elegant as it was complex. He suggested the theory of epicycles, the idea that a planet moves in a small circle, which in turn moves along the path of a much larger circle. It was a wheel within a wheel, a geometric ballet designed to save the appearances of a geocentric world. As we look at the internal clockwork of the device, we see this very philosophy translated into physical matter. The gears are not just simple cogs, they are arranged in a sophisticated system of pins and slots that mimic the varying speed of the moon. This was not merely a tool for calculation, it was a physical manifestation of the belief that the universe was a giant, predictable machine. The user of this device held the cosmos in their palms, turning a small side crank to watch the sun and moon chase each other through the months and years. It provided a sense of order in a world that often felt chaotic and unpredictable. The geocentric model, placing the Earth at the absolute center of all things, was the foundation upon which this entire mechanical universe was built. To the ancient mind, the Earth was stationary, a heavy and solid anchor, while the celestial spheres rotated around it in layers of crystalline beauty. The Antikythera Mechanism served as a bridge between the human eye and these invisible spheres. On its front face, a large circular dial displayed the path of the sun through the constellations of the zodiac. It was a visualization of the ecliptic, the imaginary line in the sky that the sun appears to follow over the course of a year. By turning the handle, one could see exactly where the sun was positioned relative to the stars, even during the bright light of day when the stars themselves were hidden from view. Integrating the heavens with the passage of human time required the merging of two very different traditions. The device features a dial that tracks the Egyptian calendar, a system of 365 days that was favored by astronomers for its mathematical simplicity. Yet, layered atop this was the Greek zodiac, divided into 12 sections named after the familiar constellations. This fusion of Egyptian and Greek wisdom tells us that the makers of this machine were heirs to a vast international body of knowledge, drawing from the deep wells of the Nile and the philosophical academies of the Mediterranean. They understood that time was not a single linear thread, but a weave of different cycles, the solar year, the lunar month, and the long, slow rhythms of the planets. Imagine a scholar or a wealthy navigator standing on the deck of a ship, perhaps the very ship that eventually foundered off the coast of Antikythera. They would have looked at the bronze dials and seen the entire year laid out before them. The outer ring of the calendar could actually be adjusted, moved by a single day every 4 years to account for the leap year, showing a startlingly advanced understanding of the solar cycle. It is a quiet, mechanical heartbeat, a way of keeping pace with the universe that feels strangely modern. The device did not just tell you the date, it told you your place in the grand design. It showed how the phases of the moon influenced the tides and the festivals, and how the position of the sun dictated the seasons of harvest and sea travel. As the gears turned, they whispered of a time when science and wonder were not yet separated. The theory of epicycles, though we now know it to be a beautiful error, allowed the ancients to predict eclipses with a margin of error of only a few hours. This level of accuracy suggests a long tradition of observation, perhaps reaching back even further to the Babylonians, whose ancient records of celestial omens were likely studied by Hipparchus and his contemporaries. The mechanism is a vessel for these lost centuries of data, a physical archive of human curiosity. It captures a moment in history when we were beginning to realize that the world worked according to laws that could be measured, mapped, and eventually mimicked in bronze. There is a profound stillness in the thought of this machine resting on the seabed for 2 millennia. While empires rose and fell, while languages changed, and the very map of the world was redrawn, the Antikythera Mechanism held within its corroded heart the blueprint of the stars. It reminds us that the quest to understand the heavens is one of the oldest stories we have. The geocentric model, with its intricate epicycles and its centered Earth, was a sincere attempt to make sense of the infinite. And though we have since moved the Earth from the center of the stage, the mechanical brilliance of this device remains a testament to what the human mind can achieve when it refuses to be humbled by the vastness of the dark. As we move deeper into the workings of the gears, we find ourselves wondering how many other such wonders were lost to the deep time of history. Was this a unique masterpiece, or was it merely one of many, a standard tool for the learned elite of the Hellenistic world? The fragments offer no easy answers, only the silent rhythmic motion of a cosmos captured in metal. We are left to contemplate the possibility that our ancestors were far more connected to the rhythms of the universe than we often care to admit, and that their machines, though powered by hand rather than electricity, were driven by the same relentless desire to know the unknown. Imagine for a moment the sound of a stylus scratching against soft wax, or the faint, rhythmic clicking of bronze teeth meeting in the darkness of a workshop in Rhodes or Corinth. This was not merely a machine, it was a map of time itself, etched into a surface that once caught the flickering lamplight of an ancient study. As we turn our attention from the internal gears to the external faces of the mechanism, we find ourselves staring into the very eyes of the Greek cosmos. The back of the device was dominated by two large spiral dials, their paths winding outward like the shell of a nautilus, guiding the observer through decades of celestial choreography. The lower spiral on the rear face is known to us as the Saros dial, a masterpiece of ancient predictive science that tracked a period of 18 years and 11 days. To the ancients, this was the Saros cycle, a window of time after which the sun, the moon, and the earth returned to nearly the same relative positions, allowing for the prediction of eclipses. Along the grooves of this bronze spiral, small inscriptions, known as glyphs, marked the months where a solar or lunar eclipse was likely to occur. These markings did not just indicate the date, but even the time of day and the direction from which the shadow would fall across the face of the celestial body. It is a staggering realization that over 2,000 years ago, a traveler could hold in their hands a device that whispered the secrets of the shadows, foretelling the exact moment the sun would be swallowed by the moon, long before the event ever darkened the sky. Just above this grand spiral sat a smaller, yet perhaps more culturally significant circle, the Olympiad dial. While the Saros cycle looked to the heavens, the Olympiad dial remained tethered to the heartbeat of the Greek world. It was a 4-year timer, a simple yet elegant pointer that tracked the cycle of the great Pan-Hellenic Games. It marked the passage of time toward the gatherings at Olympia, Pythia, Isthmia, and Nemea. In the quiet precision of this dial, we see the marriage of the divine and the human. The same machine that calculated the staggering distances of the lunar orbit also told a merchant or a scholar when it was time to set sail for the athletic festivals that defined their civilization. It reminds us that for the ancients, the motion of the stars was never separate from the motion of life on earth. The heavens were the clock by which all human drama was measured. The complexity of these pointers is difficult to overstate when one considers the era of their creation. Unlike the simple hands of a modern clock, the pointers on the Antikythera Mechanism were often tipped with delicate spheres representing the sun and the moon. On the front dial, a secondary pointer even tracked the lunar phase using a tiny rotating ball, half black and half white, that would turn to show the waxing and waning of the moon in real time. We must visualize these components not as the corroded, calcified fragments we see in a museum today, but as they were in the 2nd century before the Common Era. They would have been fashioned from polished bronze, gleaming with a golden hue, their surfaces smooth and cold to the touch. The inscriptions would have been sharp, the letters no larger than a grain of sand, yet perfectly legible to an eye trained in the nuances of the Greek alphabet. As the years passed and the device was used, perhaps the bronze began to take on a soft patina, a darkening that only highlighted the brilliance of the silver and gold inlays. The motion of the dials would have been fluid, driven by a small wooden or metal crank on the side of the case. With a slow, deliberate turn of the hand, the user could watch centuries fly by in a matter of minutes. The pointers would sweep across the Saros spiral, dancing over the eclipse markings, while the Olympiad hand crept forward, notch by notch, through the 4-year cycle of the games. It was a tactile experience of deep time, a way for a finite human being to grasp the infinite cycles of the universe and hold them, if only for a moment, within the palm of a hand. One cannot help but wonder who the last person was to see these dials in their full splendor before the ship met its fate off the coast of the tiny island of Antikythera. Was it a wealthy collector, marveling at the ingenuity of the craftsmanship? Or perhaps a navigator, using the eclipse cycles to chart a course through the unpredictable waters of the Mediterranean? As the ship settled into the silt of the seafloor, 60 meters below the surface, the polished bronze began its long, slow transformation into the green, stony fragments that would eventually baffle the modern world. The pointers grew still, the gears locked in place by the weight of the ocean and the passage of 2 millennia. Yet, even in its broken state, the mathematics remains perfect. The ratios etched into the bronze are as true today as they were when the metal was first poured and hammered. There is a certain quiet poetry in the way the Saros dial was constructed as a spiral rather than a simple circle. By using a spiral, the designer was able to create a much longer scale, allowing for more detail and a greater span of time to be represented in a compact space. It shows a level of sophisticated spatial thinking that we often wrongly assume was absent in the ancient world. They understood that time does not merely repeat, it unfolds. It stretches outward, looping back upon itself in patterns that are predictable, yet ever-changing. The back of the mechanism was a testament to this philosophy, a physical manifestation of the belief that the universe is a rational, ordered place, governed by laws that can be understood, measured, and even predicted by the human mind. Meanwhile, the front dial, which we will explore in greater depth as our journey continues, served as the primary interface for the solar and lunar calendars. It was here that the Egyptian calendar and the Greek zodiac met, layered one on top of the other. The user could see the sun's position relative to the constellations, a shimmering golden reference point in a sea of bronze. Because the Egyptian year was 365 days long and did not account for the leap year, the outer ring of the dial was designed to be adjustable. Every 4 years, the owner of the mechanism would manually move the ring back by 1 day, a small ritual of maintenance that kept the machine in harmony with the actual transit of the Earth around the sun. This tiny detail, the need for human intervention to correct the calendar, serves as a bridge between the cold perfection of the gears and the lived experience of the person who possessed it. And so, we are left to contemplate the sheer density of information contained within this wooden box. It was a library of astronomical knowledge, a mechanical codex that translated the complex mathematics of the heavens into a visual language. The pointers, the spirals, and the tiny rotating moon were more than just parts of a tool. They were symbols of a lost horizon of human achievement. We look at these dials and see a reflection of a time when the world was still full of mystery, yet human beings were already beginning to find the keys to unlock the doors of the cosmos. As the narrator of this story, I find myself imagining the silence of the workshop where this was made, the smell of the charcoal fire, the steady rasp of the file, and the unwavering focus of a master craftsman who knew that he was building something that would outlast his own life, and perhaps the very empire he called home. The mechanical complexity of the Antikythera mechanism does not simply appear out of a vacuum, for history is rarely a series of sudden leaps, but rather a slow, winding river of accumulated knowledge. To understand who could have conceived of such a device, we must look backward through the fog of time toward the shadows of the great thinkers who walked the shores of the Mediterranean centuries before the shipwreck occurred. We find ourselves drawn to the city of Syracuse on the island of Sicily, where a man named Archimedes once lived and breathed. He is a figure who looms so large in the history of science that he feels almost like a myth, yet the bronze gears found in the wreckage suggest that his legacy was very much a reality. Archimedes is often remembered for his shouts in the bath or his defense of his city against Roman siege engines, but his most profound work may have been in the quiet study of the heavens. It is whispered among historians that the Antikythera Mechanism might be a descendant of the school of Archimedes, a physical manifestation of the mathematical principles he perfected in the 3rd century before the Common Era. While Archimedes died long before this specific device was lost to the sea, the lineage of his genius seems to pulse through its corroded bronze. We imagine a lineage of students and master craftsmen passing down the secret geometry of the planets, preserving the master's vision in metal and tooth. The device is a ghost of a lost tradition, a silent witness to a level of sophistication that we once thought impossible for the ancient world. As we search for the origin of this mechanical marvel, we encounter the writings of the Roman statesman Cicero, who lived during the 1st century before the Common Era. Cicero was a man of letters and law, yet he recorded something that sounds hauntingly familiar to the modern ear. He wrote of spheres, or globes that had been brought to Rome as spoils of war. One of these, he noted, was constructed by Archimedes himself. According to Cicero's descriptions, this sphere was not merely a static map of the stars, but a moving model that could replicate the motions of the sun, the moon, and the 5 planets known to the ancients. When the device was set in motion, the celestial bodies moved in perfect harmony, just as they did in the night sky. To the Romans who witnessed it, this was not just a tool, but a piece of captured divinity, a way to hold the infinite cosmos within the palms of one's hands. The way Cicero describes these spheres suggests that the Antikythera Mechanism was not a solitary wonder, but part of a broader, though now largely vanished, tradition of high-precision instrument-making. We must ask ourselves how many other such devices were lost to the fires of war, the melting pots of later civilizations, or the crushing depths of the Mediterranean. The bronze from the Antikythera wreck was preserved only by the tragedy of the sinking, protected by the salt and the silt from being recycled into coins or weapons. It makes one wonder about the vast library of human achievement that has simply evaporated into the air of the passing centuries, leaving behind only these rare, calcified fragments to remind us of what we once knew. The path of the mechanism's creation likely led through the island of Rhodes, a sun-drenched centre of learning that sat at the crossroads of the ancient world. During the 2nd century before the Common Era, Rhodes was a vibrant hub for astronomical research, and the home of the great astronomer Hipparchus. It was here that the theoretical mathematics of the Greeks met the ancient observational data of the Babylonians, creating a synthesis of knowledge that allowed for the prediction of eclipses and planetary cycles with startling accuracy. Rhodes was a place where the air was thick with the scent of the sea and the quiet murmur of scholars debating the nature of the universe. It is highly probable that the workshop that produced the Antikythera Mechanism was located here, or perhaps its creator was a student of the Rhodian school, carrying the blueprints of the heavens in his mind as he travelled across the Aegean. When we look at the device, we are not just looking at gears and plates. We are looking at the culmination of 1,000 years of human curiosity. We are seeing the influence of the school of Syracuse, the observations of Rhodes, and the mechanical traditions that spanned from the shores of North Africa to the islands of Greece. The device bridges the gap between the abstract world of geometry and the physical world of engineering. It suggests a time when the boundaries between science, art, and philosophy were fluid, when a mathematician could also be a clockmaker, and a philosopher could be a navigator. The ghost of Archimedes resides in the precision of the gear teeth, a silent reminder that the ancient mind was capable of reaching out and touching the stars, long before the first telescope was ever pointed toward the dark velvet of the night. As the years passed and the Roman Empire rose to dominance, much of this specialized knowledge began to fade from the public record. The intricate craftsmanship required to build such a machine became a rarity, a secret kept by a diminishing number of masters. The Antikythera Mechanism represents a peak of achievement, a high watermark of ancient technology that would not be seen again for over a millennium. It is a sobering thought to realize that humanity can reach such heights of understanding, only to have that knowledge slip through its fingers like sand. We are left to ponder the silence of the centuries that followed, the long sleep of the mechanical arts, and the quiet patience of the bronze gears as they waited in the dark, pressurized cradle of the shipwreck, holding on to the secrets of the school of Archimedes until the world was finally ready to find them again. The connection to Rhodes also brings to mind the figure of Posidonius, a polymath who lived on the island and was known to have constructed a planetary model similar to the one Cicero described. It is as if we are tracing the fingerprints of a small, elite group of geniuses who were obsessed with the clockwork nature of existence. They saw the universe not as a chaotic whim of the gods, but as a grand, orderly machine that followed immutable laws. By building the Antikythera Mechanism, they were attempting to speak the language of the cosmos, translating the infinite cycles of time into a scale that a human being could comprehend. The device is a testament to the belief that the universe is knowable, that its mysteries can be decoded, and that even in an age of bronze and stone, the human spirit was already yearning for the stars. We sit now in the quiet of our own time, looking back through the lens of archaeology at these faint traces of a lost brilliance, the school of Archimedes, the libraries of Rhodes, the observations of Hipparchus. They all converge in this one battered, green-crusted object. It serves as a bridge across the deep time of the Mediterranean, connecting the shipwrecked past to our modern understanding of the world. And as we continue to clean the silt from the gears and peer into the inner workings of the device, we are not just uncovering a machine, we are reuniting with a part of our own history that was almost forgotten. A reminder that the quest for knowledge is as old as the tides, and that the ghosts of the past are always there, waiting to guide us if we only have the patience to listen. Deep within the structural integrity of the oxidized bronze, a secret remained held in a silent, metallic grip for over 2,000 years, waiting for a light strong enough to pierce the veil of time without shattering the delicate remains. By the year 2005, the fragments of the Antikythera Mechanism had become more than just archaeological curiosities. They were a challenge to the limits of modern physics. To touch them was to risk their destruction, yet to leave them unexamined was to allow the greatest mind of antiquity to remain a shadow. And so, a collaborative effort known as the Antikythera Mechanism Research Project brought together mathematicians, astronomers, and historians from across the globe, all converging on a single, ambitious goal: to see through the solid stone and corrosion that had become the machine's second skin. They realized that the traditional methods of the past, the simple photographs and the grainy X-rays of the 1970s, had only scratched the surface of this deep time enigma. What was required was something far more powerful, a way to slice through the bronze virtually, layer by microscopic layer, until the very heart of the machine was exposed. A massive 8-ton machine was meticulously transported to the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. A piece of equipment so specialized it seemed almost as alien as the device it was meant to study. This was the micro-focus X-ray computed tomography scanner, a marvel of contemporary engineering designed to peer into the infinitesimal gaps of industrial components. But here, in the quiet halls of the museum, its purpose was far more poetic. As the scanner began its slow, methodical work, it cast a high-resolution beam through the fragments, capturing thousands of individual images from every conceivable angle. The researchers watched as the data began to coalesce on their screens, transforming the jagged green lumps of metal into translucent three-dimensional ghosts. For the first time in 2 millennia, the internal architecture of the device was revealed in its entirety. They saw gears within gears, teeth so fine they resembled the delicate serrations of a leaf, and pins that held the complex assemblies in place with a precision that defied the supposed technological limitations of the ancient world. But as the digital layers were peeled back, something even more profound began to emerge from the darkness. Hidden inside the very thickness of the bronze plates and buried beneath layers of calcium and sea growth were thousands of tiny etched characters. These were not the bold inscriptions of a monument meant for public display, but the intimate, functional notes of a master craftsman. The CT scans revealed a hidden manual of sorts, a user's guide inscribed in Greek letters so small they were invisible to the naked eye, some measuring less than 2 millimeters in height. As the researchers digitally enhanced these faint traces, they found themselves reading the thoughts of an ancient scientist. The text spoke of the cycles of the sun and the moon, the movements of the planets, and the timing of the great Pan-Hellenic games. It was as if a voice was whispering across the ages, explaining the purpose of every dial and the meaning of every rotation. The mechanism was no longer a silent relic. It was a living document, a testament to a level of literacy and scientific sophistication that many had believed was impossible for the 1st century before the Common Era. The discovery of these inscriptions changed everything. It provided the Rosetta Stone for the device, allowing the team to cross-reference the physical gears with the written instructions. With every new word deciphered, the complexity of the machine grew more staggering. The text described a display of the zodiac, the phases of the moon, and even the prediction of eclipses, complete with the specific hour and the color the moon would turn as it passed through the Earth's shadow. The researchers realized that the Antikythera Mechanism was not just a calculator, but a miniature cosmos, a physical manifestation of the heavens that one could hold in their hands. The sheer density of information contained within those few fragments suggested that this was not a unique prototype, but rather the pinnacle of a long-lost tradition of Greek mechanical engineering, a tradition that had been swallowed by the sea and the shifting sands of history. As the data from the micro-focus CT scans was processed, it allowed for the creation of a full digital reconstruction, filling in the gaps where the original bronze had long since dissolved into the salt water. The scientists could now simulate the movement of the gears with mathematical certainty. They watched on their monitors as the virtual wheels turned in perfect harmony, calculating the metonic cycle, a 19-year period that synchronizes the solar and lunar calendars. They saw how a special pin and slot mechanism was used to mimic the irregular orbit of the moon, an achievement of such mechanical genius that it would not be seen again in Europe for over 1,000 years. The reconstruction revealed a front dial that showed the position of the sun and moon in the zodiac, and a back dial that tracked the cycles of eclipses and the calendar of the ancient world. It was a bridge built of mathematics and metal, spanning the vast gulf between the earth and the stars. This digital resurrection provided a window into a world where science and art were inseparable. The researchers could see the tool marks left by the maker, the tiny adjustments made to ensure that each gear meshed perfectly with its neighbor. They began to wonder who could have possessed such knowledge. Was it the work of the great astronomer Hipparchus, or perhaps a student of the legendary Archimedes? The inscriptions suggested a connection to the island of Rhodes, a center of ancient learning, but the true identity of the creator remained hidden in the deep time of the Mediterranean. The more they learned, the more they realized how much had been lost. The Antikythera Mechanism was a singular survivor of a vanished age of enlightenment, a reminder that the path of human progress is not always a steady climb, but a series of peaks and valleys where great heights of knowledge can be reached and then forgotten for centuries. The work of the Antikythera Mechanism research project in 2005 did more than just explain a machine. It restored a sense of wonder to the study of the past. It showed that the ancients were not merely observers of the natural world, but masters of it, capable of distilling the infinite complexity of the heavens into a box of bronze and wood. As the digital models continue to be refined, and as the last of the inscriptions are painstakingly read, we find ourselves standing on the threshold of a new understanding of our own history. We are reminded that beneath the surface of the world we know there are always deeper layers, waiting for the right light to reveal their secrets. And in the quiet hum of the laboratory, as the virtual gears turn in their eternal dance, we can almost hear the ticking of a heart that was thought to have stopped forever, a pulse of human ingenuity that continues to beat, steady and true, across the vast and silent stretches of time. To look upon the Antikythera Mechanism is to confront a silence that lasts for over 1,000 years. It is a quiet, heavy truth that settles over the mind like the silt on the Mediterranean floor, the realization that a pinnacle of human thought was reached, and then, inexplicably, it was let go. We often like to imagine history as a steady, upward climb, a ladder where each rung is built firmly upon the one below it. We assume that once a discovery is made, it becomes part of our collective DNA, passed down from father to son, from teacher to student, until it reaches us today. But the bronze gears of this device tell a different, more haunting story. They suggest that history is not a ladder, but a series of waves, rising to magnificent heights only to break and recede back into the dark, churning depths of time. After the ship carrying this treasure splintered against the rocks of the island, the knowledge required to build such a thing seemed to evaporate from the world. For 10 centuries, the complex, interlocking teeth of precision gearing vanished from the archaeological record, while the stars continued their slow, rhythmic processions through the night sky. The tools used to track them fell into ruin and rust. It is a gap in the human story so vast that it feels almost impossible to fathom. We must wait until the 14th century in medieval Europe, more than 1,300 years after the Antikythera ship went down, to see anything even remotely comparable. Only then do we see the emergence of the first great mechanical clocks, those towering iron giants that began to chime in the cathedrals of Italy and France. And yet, even those early clocks, as impressive as they were, often lacked the sheer mathematical sophistication found in the shoebox-sized device from the ancient world. It is a humbling thought to consider that a scientist in the 1st century before the Common Era possessed a deeper mechanical understanding of the heavens than almost anyone living in the year 1000. As the centuries of the early Middle Ages drifted by, the very idea of a machine that could calculate the future became the stuff of myth and legend. The sophisticated bronze-working techniques, the intricate knowledge of epicyclic gearing, which we might think of as gears within gears, and the high-level geometry needed to map the moon's irregular orbit. All of it was buried. It was as if a light had been extinguished, leaving the world to navigate by flickering candles for a millennium. We find ourselves wondering how many other missing millenniums exist in our past. How many other heights were reached, only to be forgotten as empires crumbled and libraries burned? Archaeology is often a study of what survives, but the Antikythera Mechanism forces us to contemplate what was lost. We rely heavily on stratigraphy, the study of soil layers that act as a timeline of human activity, and radiocarbon dating, which measures the decay of carbon atoms to tell us how old an object is. These methods are precise, and they give us a framework for the past, but they can only tell us about the things we actually find. They cannot speak for the wooden machines that rotted away, or the bronze tools that were melted down to make swords and shields during times of war. The mechanism survived only by a miracle of tragedy, by the very fact that it was lost to the sea, protected by the crushing pressure and the cold, salt water. Had it remained on land, it almost certainly would have been recycled, its precious metal repurposed, its genius erased by the simple practical needs of a declining civilization. As the years passed and the Roman Empire slowly lost its grip on the Mediterranean, the specialized workshops that could produce such precision instruments likely closed their doors. The master craftsmen died without apprentices to carry on their secrets. The scrolls containing the mathematical proofs were lost to dampness or fire. And so the world moved on. It is a reminder of the fragility of our own era, a whisper from the deep time that reminds us how quickly the things we take for granted can slip through our fingers. We look at our own computers, our own satellites and digital networks, and we feel a sense of permanence. But the Antikythera Mechanism warns us that permanence is an illusion. It is a ghost from a future that never happened, or perhaps a future that was delayed by 1,000 years. One cannot help but speculate on what other advanced technologies might be resting beneath the waves, or buried under the shifting sands of the Sahara. If the Greeks could build a computer to track the moon and the sun, what else were they capable of? Were there steam-powered toys that never became engines? Were there optical lenses that never became telescopes? We see hints of these things in the ancient texts, stories of burning mirrors and mechanical birds, but without the physical evidence, we have always dismissed them as flights of fancy. The mechanism proves that the fancy was real. It proves that the ancient mind was just as capable of complex, abstract engineering as our own. The only difference is the continuity of knowledge. The more we study the device, the more we realize that it wasn't a solitary invention. It was the product of a long tradition, a school of thought that must have flourished for generations. You do not simply wake up one morning and invent the differential gear. It requires a culture of inquiry, a stable economy, and a shared language of mathematics. All of those things existed in the Hellenistic world, and then, quite suddenly, they were gone. The transition from the classical world to the medieval period was not just a change in government. It was a fundamental shift in how humanity interacted with the physical laws of the universe. We moved away from the precise mechanical observation of nature and toward a more symbolic spiritual interpretation of the world. The gears stopped turning, and the world grew quiet. There is a certain melancholy in this realization, a feeling of standing at the edge of a great canyon and looking across to a peak we once stood upon. We spent centuries trying to find our way back to that level of mechanical mastery. When we finally did, during the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, we acted as though we were discovering these principles for the first time. We called it a rebirth, unaware that the child had already been born, lived, and been forgotten long ago. The Antikythera Mechanism is a bridge across that canyon. It allows us to reach back across the missing millennium and touch the hands of the engineers who saw the universe as a beautiful, predictable machine. As we sit in the stillness of the present moment, listening to the soft pulse of our own time, it is worth reflecting on the limits of what we know. Our understanding of history is like a map with vast, blank spaces marked unknown. We find a fragment here, a shipwreck there, and we try to stitch them together into a coherent narrative. But the narrative is full of holes. The Antikythera Mechanism is a reminder that the past was much larger, much stranger, and much more sophisticated than we often give it credit for. It invites us to be humble in the face of deep time, to recognize that we are just one more wave in a long, long line of waves rising and falling in the dark. And as the virtual gears of the reconstructed device continue to spin on our screens, they serve as a silent vigil for all the lost inventions and forgotten geniuses whose names have been washed away by the tides of history. Imagine the sound of a small bronze saw biting into a thin sheet of metal, a rhythmic metallic rasp echoing through a workshop in a sun-drenched Mediterranean port 2,000 years ago. There are no massive factories here, no humming assembly lines or precision lasers. There is only the steady hand of a master craftsman, a set of iron files, and a vision of the cosmos that defied the limitations of his tools. When we look closely at the fragments of the Antikythera Mechanism, we are looking at the very edges of what human hands could achieve in the ancient world. The physical construction is a testament to a level of patience that feels almost alien to our modern, hurried minds. Each of the dozens of gears was not cast in a mold, but painstakingly hand-cut from a single plate of bronze. The teeth are tiny triangles, some no larger than a grain of sand, filed down with such incredible consistency that they could mesh together without jamming. To hold a single gear in one's hand is to feel the weight of 1,000 hours of concentration, a quiet, solitary labour, performed under the flickering light of an oil lamp. And yet, despite the complexity of the mathematics it contained, the device itself was remarkably humble in its physical presence. It was not a grand, monumental clock meant to sit in a temple or a palace square. Instead, it was housed in a modest wooden case, likely made of cedar or oak, roughly the size of a shoebox. It was designed to be portable, an instrument that a navigator could carry in a leather satchel, or a philosopher could tuck under his arm while walking to a lecture. In this small, unassuming box, the entire clockwork of the heavens was compressed into a space that could be held in the lap. The joinery of the mechanism reveals a fascinating blend of high-level engineering and practical, almost rustic solutions. To hold the various layers of the device together, the maker used a system of tiny pins and wedges. There are no screws here. The screw as a fastening device had not yet become a standard part of the engineer's toolkit. Instead, the craftsman relied on friction and precision. Each pin had to be exactly the right diameter to hold a gear in place against its axle, and each wedge was tapped into place with just enough force to secure the frame without warping the delicate bronze. It is a masterpiece of tension and balance, a structure that feels organic, as if it were grown rather than built. As we visualize the device in its original, pristine state, we can almost feel the texture of the wood and the cool, smooth surface of the bronze dials. The user experience of the Antikythera Mechanism was one of profound intimacy. On the side of the wooden case, there was a small circular handle, a hand crank that served as the interface between the human hand and the movements of the stars. To use the device was to engage in a form of time travel. By turning that crank, the operator could accelerate the passage of days, months, and years. With a few slow rotations, one could watch the moon's phase wax and wane on the front dial, while on the back, the spiral calendars tracked the coming of the eclipses and the cycles of the great Pan-Hellenic games. It was a tactile way of understanding the universe, a way to reach out and touch the invisible rhythms that govern our lives. There is a certain magic in that motion, the simple act of turning a crank and watching the sun and moon dance in perfect synchronization. For the ancient observer, this was more than just a calculation. It was a realization that the chaos of the natural world was underpinned by a deep mathematical order. The mechanism didn't just tell the time, it revealed the hidden architecture of reality. It allowed a person to stand on a rocky shore in the 2nd century before the Common Era and look forward into the future or backward into the past with the same ease as turning a page in a book. And so, we find ourselves reflecting on the portability of this knowledge. The fact that such a sophisticated understanding of the cosmos could be distilled into a handheld box suggests a world where science was not just the province of sedentary scholars, but a tool for those who travelled and explored. It was a companion for the long voyage, a silent guide through the dark waters of the Mediterranean. As the years passed and the wooden case began to weather, the bronze inside remained remarkably resilient, protected from the elements until the day the ship finally foundered off the coast of Antikythera. Even then, as the device sank into the silt and the wood began to rot away, the gears held their positions for a time, a frozen snapshot of the heavens at the moment of the wreck. We are left to wonder about the hands that turned that crank for the very last time. Were they the hands of a wealthy merchant, checking the dates for a safe return home, or perhaps a scholar, marvelling at the alignment of the planets as the storm clouds gathered on the horizon? The physical construction of the device tells us that it was meant to be used, to be touched, and to be lived with. It was a bridge between the abstract beauty of the stars and the practical reality of human life. In the silence of the deep sea, the pins and wedges eventually gave way, and the gears settled into the positions where the sponge divers would find them 2 millennia later. But even in its fragmented state, the craftsmanship remains visible. The ghost of a thumbprint on a filed edge, the slight taper of a hand-cut pin, these are the marks of a human being who looked at the vast, terrifying infinity of space and decided to build a map of it, a map that could fit in the palm of a hand. The Antikythera Mechanism reminds us that the history of technology is not a straight line of constant progress, but a series of peaks and valleys. We often imagine the people of the past as being simpler than us, but the precision of these hand-cut gears tells a different story. It tells of a civilization that possessed the intellectual fire to decode the heavens and the manual dexterity to forge that knowledge into bronze. As we drift further into the history of this remarkable object, we must acknowledge the sheer fragility of such an achievement. To create something so complex with such basic tools requires a culture that values precision above all else. A culture that is willing to spend years perfecting a single box of gears. And yet, for all its brilliance, the knowledge required to build such a thing would eventually vanish, leaving behind only these green, encrusted fragments to haunt our imagination. The device sits now in a museum case, its gears no longer turning, its crank long since lost to the currents. But in our minds, we can still hear the faint, ghostly click of the bronze teeth engaging, a mechanical heartbeat echoing across the centuries. It is a sound that speaks of our eternal desire to measure the unmeasurable, and to find our place among the turning spheres of the deep, dark night. The ocean does not surrender its secrets easily, nor does it give them up all at once. For over a century after the first divers emerged gasping from the waters of Antikythera, the site remained a silent, shadowed tomb, guarded by the crushing weight of the Mediterranean. But as the 21st century dawned, a new generation of explorers returned to the site, armed with technology that the ancient Greeks themselves might have recognized as a form of magic. They did not come with hand-pumped airlines or heavy copper helmets, but with pressurized suits that looked like something from a dream of the future. This was the era of the exosuit, a massive atmospheric diving system that allows a human being to descend hundreds of feet while remaining at the same pressure as the surface. It is a suit of iron and titanium, a mechanical shell that protects the fragile human frame from the immense power of the deep. As the divers descended once more to the wreck, they moved like slow metallic ghosts through the silt, their lights cutting through a darkness that had remained undisturbed for 2,000 years. Alongside them swam autonomous underwater vehicles, sleek robotic scouts that mapped the seafloor with a precision that would have stunned the early sponge divers. These machines used sonar and high-resolution cameras to create a digital ghost of the shipwreck, revealing that the debris field was far larger than anyone had previously imagined. The ship, it seems, was even more massive than the initial estimates suggested. It was a titan of the ancient world, perhaps a grain freighter, or a luxury vessel carrying the looted treasures of a fallen empire. And as the modern teams began to brush away the sediment, they realized they were not just looking at a single point of impact, but a trail of history scattered across a jagged underwater landscape. They found ceramic jars still sealed, bronze statues buried to the neck in sand, and even human remains, the bones of those who went down with the ship, now part of the very stratigraphy of the seabed. Stratigraphy is a simple word for a profound concept. It is the study of layers, the way time stacks itself in the earth, one century resting upon the shoulders of the one before it. In the silts of Antikythera, the layers of the first century before the Common Era are preserved in a cold, anaerobic embrace, waiting for a gentle hand to reveal them. As the expeditions continued throughout the 2010s and into the early 20s, a quiet thrill began to circulate among the researchers. They were finding more fragments, small, encrusted pieces of bronze that looked remarkably like the pieces of the original mechanism. This raised a question that hangs in the water like a mist. Could there have been more than one? Is it possible that the Antikythera ship was carrying a second device, perhaps a newer model or a specialized instrument for a different part of the heavens? Or perhaps these fragments are the missing pieces of the first, the gears that would finally complete the puzzle and reveal the full extent of its complexity. The thought that another mechanical heart might be beating beneath the sand, just out of reach, is enough to keep the world's finest archaeologists returning to those treacherous waters year after year. The mystery of the wreck extends beyond the bronze gears. The sheer scale of the cargo suggests a level of wealth and organization that challenges our understanding of the ancient economy. We see a world that was deeply interconnected, where the high technology of Rhodes or Alexandria could be shipped across the sea to the villas of Rome. It reminds us that the flow of knowledge is not always a steady, upward climb. It is a tide that ebbs and flows. There are long stretches of deep time where the most brilliant achievements of a civilization can simply vanish, swallowed by the waves or buried by the dust of conflict. We look at the Antikythera Mechanism and we see a peak of human ingenuity, followed by a valley of nearly 1,500 years before anything of similar complexity appeared again in the historical record. It is a sobering reflection on the fragility of our own progress. In the quiet of the deep, the divers found something else, a massive bronze arm reaching out from the silt as if seeking help. It belonged to a statue far larger than any recovered by the first divers in 1900. This suggests that the greatest treasures of the ship may still be hidden, pinned beneath massive boulders that were likely dropped onto the wreck by an underwater landslide centuries ago. The ship is a labyrinth of stone and wood, a puzzle box that may take another century to fully unpack. Every time a new piece of bronze is brought to the surface, every time a piece of wood is subjected to radiocarbon dating, a process that measures the decay of carbon atoms to tell us exactly when a living thing died, we move a few inches closer to the truth. We learn that the wood of the ship was harvested from the forests of the Mediterranean in the middle of the 1st century before the Common Era, and that the ship likely met its end during a fierce storm while navigating the narrow strait between Crete and the Peloponnese. But even with our chemical signatures and our robotic eyes, the ship remains a phantom. It is often called the Titanic of the ancient world, not just because of its size, but because of the way it captures our collective imagination. It represents a moment frozen in time, a snapshot of a day when the wind blew too hard and the sea rose too high. The people on board had no idea that their journey would end in a museum case 2 millennia later. They were simply travelling, perhaps dreaming of the port they would never reach, unaware that they were carrying the most sophisticated piece of technology the world would see for over 1,000 years. As the sun sets over the modern harbour and the research vessels dock for the night, the work continues in the laboratories. Scientists use microcomputed tomography to peer through the layers of corrosion, looking for the ghost of a gear or the faint outline of an inscription. They are looking for the why behind the what. Why was this device built? Who was it for? Was it a unique masterpiece, the work of a lone genius like Archimedes, or was it the product of a thriving industry of clockmakers and astronomers whose names have been erased from history? The more we find, the more we realize that the ancient world was far more crowded with ideas than we ever dared to believe. The darkness of the past is not a void, it is a crowded room, and we are only just beginning to find the light switch. The ongoing excavations at Antikythera serve as a bridge between the ages. They remind us that we are part of a long, continuous story of curiosity and exploration. The same stars that the mechanism tracked so precisely still hang above us tonight, indifferent to the rise and fall of the empires that try to name them. We look at the fragments and we see a reflection of our own desire to understand the universe, to map its rhythms and predict its movements. It is a quiet, persistent quest, a mechanical heartbeat that refuses to be silenced by the weight of the ocean or the passage of 2,000 years. And so, we wait. We wait for the next dive, the next discovery, the next piece of the gear that might finally click into place. We listen to the stories told by the silt and the bronze, knowing that the sea still holds much more than it has given up. The shipwreck is not a closed book. It is a library where the pages are being turned very, very slowly. As we drift towards sleep, we can imagine the divers descending once more, their lights flickering like distant stars in the cold blue depths, searching for the remnants of a world that was once as bright and as certain as our own. The Antikythera Mechanism rests now in the quiet halls of a museum, far from the crushing weight of the Mediterranean, yet it remains a bridge spanning a gulf of 2,000 years. It is a physical manifestation of a thought process we once believed was exclusive to the modern age. A complex lattice of bronze teeth and interlocking silver gears that connects the intuitive observations of the ancient shepherd to the digital logic of the silicon chip. We often think of history as a straight line, a steady climb from the primitive to the sophisticated, but this device suggests something more circular, a cycle of forgetting and remembering that mirrors the very orbits it was designed to track. As we consider the intricate craftsmanship of the device, we are really looking at the human desire to capture the infinite within a finite box. It was an attempt to take the terrifying vast movements of the cosmos, the unpredictable eclipses, the wandering paths of the 5 known planets, the shifting phases of the moon, and shrink them down until they could be held in the palm of a hand. There is a profound comfort in this. The idea that the universe, for all its staggering scale, follows a rhythm that can be understood, predicted, and even touched. The craftsmen who sat in their workshops 2 centuries before the Common Era were not so different from the engineers of today. They were driven by that same restless curiosity, that same need to map the dark corners of our existence and find the underlying order hidden beneath the chaos of the natural world. This machine was more than a calculator. It was a mirror. It reflected a civilization that looked at the stars not just with wonder, but with a mathematical precision that we are only now beginning to fully appreciate. When we look at the fragments of the mechanism, we see the echoes of a lost scientific revolution, a moment in time when the human mind reached out and grasped the mechanics of the heavens. It makes one wonder how many other such bridges have been lost to the tides of time, buried under layers of silt or melted down for scrap during the hungry centuries of the Dark Ages. The Antikythera shipwreck is a single data point in a vast, mostly empty graph of human achievement, a reminder that our ancestors possessed a depth of knowledge that frequently defies our modern expectations. The sea is a patient guardian of these secrets. It does not give them up easily, nor does it preserve them in the way we might wish. The salt and the currents work slowly, turning bronze into green stone and wood into ghost-like shells of what they once were. And yet, there is a strange beauty in this decay. The mechanism has become a part of the geology of the ocean floor, a fossil of human thought that spent 2 millennia in the company of sponges and silt. It waited through the rise and fall of empires, through the changing of languages and the reshaping of continents, silent and unmoving in the dark. As we drift further into the quiet of the night, we might reflect on the eternal horizon that the Greeks so carefully studied. The stars they tracked with their bronze gears are the same stars that gaze down upon us now. The moon that pooled at the tides of the Antikythera Strait 2,000 years ago is the same moon that casts its pale light over our own world tonight. There is a continuity in this, a sense that we are part of a long, unbroken chain of observers who have all, in our own way, tried to make sense of the great silence of the universe. The mechanism is a message in a bottle from a distant shore, telling us that we have never been alone in our quest for understanding. Perhaps the greatest lesson of the Antikythera mechanism is not what it tells us about the past, but what it suggests about the future. It reminds us that knowledge is fragile, that the heights of technological achievement can be swallowed by the waves and forgotten for 100 generations. It encourages a certain humility, a realization that we are merely the current stewards of a fire that has been passed down through the ages, sometimes flickering low, sometimes burning bright. The secrets still held by the sea, the other mechanisms, the lost libraries, the sunken cities, are waiting for a time when we are ready to find them. They are the silent witnesses to our journey, resting in the cool blue depths where the light of the sun never reaches. The ocean remains the Earth's greatest museum, a vast and watery archive where the temperature is constant and the movements are slow. For every fragment we have recovered from the Antikythera wreck, there are likely a dozen more still resting in the sand, just out of reach of our current lights. There may be gears that calculate the movements of stars we haven't even considered, or inscriptions that explain philosophies we have yet to rediscover. The sea does not hurry. It keeps its treasures until the moment is exactly right. And so, we continue to look toward the horizon, both the one that meets the sky and the one that hides beneath the waves, knowing that the story is far from over. In the stillness of this moment, we can let the weight of these centuries wash over us like a gentle tide, the ticking of the clock, the steady breath of the sleeper, the slow rotation of the earth. All of these are part of the same grand machinery that the ancient Greeks sought to capture in bronze. There is no need for answers tonight, only the peaceful acceptance of the mystery. The gears have stopped turning, the ship has found its final resting place, and the stars continue their silent dance across the velvet sky. We are travelers on a vast ocean of time, and for now, the waters are calm. As the mind begins to settle, the images of the shipwreck fade into a soft blue haze. We see the glint of bronze in the sand, the flickering light of a diver's lamp, and the endless, rolling waves of the Mediterranean. The past and the present merge into a single quiet stream, carrying us toward a place of rest. The secrets of the Antikythera mechanism are safe, held in the memory of the world and in the dreams of those who look to the stars. The horizon is wide, the night is deep, and the sea is finally at peace. We imagine the heavy silence of the deep, the way the water muffles all sound until there is only the rhythmic pulse of the currents. Down there time moves differently. A century is but a layer of dust. 1,000 years is a slow shift in the dunes. The mechanism rests in its glass case now, but a part of it will always belong to the silt and the cold. It is a ghost of a world that once was, a world of marble and fire and brilliant, restless intellect. And as we close our eyes, we join that world in its long, deep sleep, drifting through the dark toward the first light of a distant, ancient dawn.